At Quantico Marine Base, she stood at rigid attention in the oak-paneled conference room, surrounded by admirals who wanted her head for what they called insubordination. The court-martial papers were already drafted. Her career was over. But when the Secretary of Defense leaned forward and asked one final question, her four legendary words didn't just save her career, they made her the youngest admiral in naval history. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved for you. The conference room at Quantico Marine Base had witnessed the rise and fall of countless military careers, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold on this humid Virginia morning. Commander Elena Sterling stood rigidly at attention, her dress blue uniform immaculate despite the storm of controversy swirling around her name. To her left sat Admiral Grant Ellison, his weathered face carved with the kind of disapproval that had ended promising careers before they'd truly begun. To her right, Admiral Naomi Carver drummed her fingers against the polished table with barely contained irritation. Both had signed off on the preliminary court-martial recommendation that morning. Behind them, a gallery of senior officers filled leather chairs like a jury of peers who had already reached their verdict. Their expressions ranged from disappointment to outright hostility. After all, Commander Sterling had done the unthinkable. She directly contradicted a superior officer's direct order in front of international allies during the most critical naval exercise in a decade. The media had gotten hold of the story within hours. "Rogue commander defies orders," screamed the headlines. Defense analysts on cable news were already speculating about court-martial proceedings, debating whether her actions constituted gross insubordination or something even worse. Her academy classmates were quietly distancing themselves from the scandal. But the Secretary of Defense, Lorraine Whitfield, insisted on this closed-door hearing before any formal charges were filed. Something about Sterling's service record, 14 years of exemplary performance, 3 combat deployments, a Distinguished Service Cross for Valor, didn't align with the narrative of a reckless officer who'd suddenly gone rogue. Secretary Whitfield studied Sterling's file, her expression unreadable, which makes this incident all the more puzzling. Career officers don't typically throw away 14 years of distinguished service on a moment of tactical disagreement. There has to be more to this story. 3 weeks earlier, during Exercise Atlantic Fortress, Commander Sterling had identified patterns in enemy tactics that suggested traditional defensive strategies were becoming vulnerable to coordinated attacks designed specifically to exploit Allied predictability. Her analysis proved correct when enemy forces used innovative tactics that nearly overwhelmed the defensive screen. Sterling's unauthorized tactical modifications not only saved the exercise, but prevented what intelligence later confirmed would have been a catastrophic demonstration of Allied naval vulnerabilities to multiple adversary nations monitoring the operation. "Commander Sterling," the Secretary said finally, her voice carrying the weight of final judgment, "before we proceed with formal charges, I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer." The room held its collective breath. Even the soft hum of air conditioning seemed to fade into absolute silence. "Given everything that's at stake, your career, your reputation, your family's military legacy, do you still maintain that your actions during Exercise Atlantic Fortress were justified?" Commander Sterling's eyes shifted from the wall to meet the Secretary's gaze directly. What happened next would either validate the court-martial recommendation or expose something that had been overlooked in the rush to judgment. Sterling took a deep breath, her voice carrying 14 years of naval experience and the conviction of someone who had weighed the consequences and found them acceptable. "I was right, ma'am." Those 4 words hit the room like a physical force, not an elaborate justification or complex explanation of tactical theory, but a simple statement of professional commitment that acknowledged both the necessity of her actions and her willingness to accept whatever consequences followed. The international observers exchanged meaningful glances. Admiral Carver set down her pen. Admiral Ellison nodded slowly, recognizing the kind of leadership that couldn't be taught in any academy. Whitfield studied Sterling's file for several more seconds, then addressed the room with new authority. Considering that Commander Sterling prevented strategic intelligence compromise, successfully countered enemy tactics, and demonstrated the kind of adaptive leadership our Navy needs to counter evolving threats, the transformation in the room was palpable. What had begun as a court-martial hearing had become something unprecedented. "Commander Sterling," Whitfield continued, her voice carrying ceremonial weight, "based on your tactical innovation during Exercise Atlantic Fortress, I am recommending your immediate promotion and assignment to the Naval War College as Director of Adaptive Tactical Doctrine." The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. Promotion instead of court-martial. Recognition instead of disgrace. "Your 4 words, 'I was right, ma'am,' will be studied in military academies for generations. They represent commitment to mission accomplishment that transcends personal consequences." Sterling looked at the promotion documents, then back at the secretary. "Madam Secretary, what will you do with this opportunity?" "I'll make sure no Allied sailor ever dies because we were too rigid to adapt when adaptation could save lives."